to welcome you to this session on participatory and creative methods of data gathering. So this is going to be quite a bit different than what I did yesterday, although you might notice some of the same slides, but this time I'm going to be talking about what we did and why we did it, how we did it. So I just want to start by situating myself as I'm a community-based researcher. I'm also an academic, and I came out of community-based research primarily through two ways. One is doing community-based research not as an academic, but as a community activist, and also my work in international development played a big role in that. So I guess the area in which I now situate myself is primarily in adult non-formal learning. So I see myself as playing a role in community social movements and educating people to work inside community-based research and inside social and political movements. So I see community-based research as something that's potentially transformational. I've also done research on transformation because it's a really complex term, and though we talk about, especially in adult ed, and this will be, we talk about Mesereau and we talk about Paulo Freire primarily. Paulo Freire talks about social transformation. Mesereau talks more about individual transformation. And as we do research on transformation, what we find is that they're both really blurry, and usually in order for there to be any kind of social transformation, it occurs on individual levels first and foremost, and is often not sustained. So it's the sustaining of transformation that also becomes problematic in that context. So I can talk more about that later because we did a participatory action research on sustaining transformation, but I'll get to that. I see this process as one that's political and involves work towards social justice. I think these are themes that have come up again and again, and that those changes in social justice are also about changing structures of power, so of imbalances in power and how those get played out. And I understand that they're played out on community levels, they're played out in academic levels, they're played out between communities and academics, and they're played out, of course, in larger macro structural levels. And I'm interested in doing research where learning is to create change, where the primary beneficiaries are people in the communities. So in terms of my work in international development, I came to understand, I guess, PLA, Participatory Learning in Action. It's also called PRA, Participatory Rural Appraisal. Thank you very much. And if anybody's interested in these methodologies, I suggest you take a look at the role of Robert Chambers, who was the first person I ever heard who knew so much about a topic and insisted he was not an expert. And so I think we can get rid of that word really quick. So in doing participatory learning in action, it became really clear to me, working with community organizations, how we envision structures of power and how they operate. So for example, in the lower slide there, where there's a picture of a couple women gathering materials, this was training that we were doing. We were doing field work in Ethiopia for a community-based research project that involved PLA, and the researchers went to the car to get the flip charts and markers to start gathering the data. And we were going to do community mapping. So community mapping is where you do a map of the area you live in, where you have relationships in that community. You might draw your household, where you get water from in your household, where you have your food in, or where you buy your food in the store, etc. So you map out all this area. So the researchers went to the vehicle to get flip chart and markers, and I was just standing there with my mouth open because I thought, this is never going to work. The people we're working with have not held marker, likely, and certainly are not accustomed to working with flip charts and markers. So, you know, it was also a process of realizing you had to use the right tools to do the process. So, in this case, we divided people into a group of women and a group of men because it was really clear that the way women envision their world and the resources around it very differently than men. And we used the dirt. So the women actually created a map that was about 1/4 or less the size that the group of men created. But very quickly, the farmers were able to gather the materials, the stones, the twigs, the grass, whatever it is that they needed to create their map. And they, you know, it was so clear that they knew what they were doing. And everybody in the process, myself included, just stood there like this. It was just amazing how easily they could, you know, use those tools to create a replica of their life. And we could have had the most colorful Lego in the world and it would have never worked, right? So it was about using the right tool to try and enact a process. The slide in the upper left-hand corner, I'm not going to go through a lot, but just suffice to say that that was a ranking exercise. And what we did is we used rocks and just drew lines and had people rank. It was a ranking exercise for where the community wells should be located. And they had already been through a process. But I'm just suggesting that looking at PRA or looking at some of the tools that are used in international development might provide you with some actual stimulation for ideas that you can adapt depending on where you're working and the community you're working with. Because they tend to be, some of them tend to be fairly good for assessing the situation. So again, another area that I come out of is adult education and popular education. So I used to do popular education work in communities, in literacy projects, in friendship centers, and you know, having people assess their situation, their lived experience, what was going on, identifying issues in that lived experience, and then adding theory to the issues or politicizing the issues so that people could then come to a process where they're talking about what might be solutions to that, those kinds of dilemmas. And I noticed today, so I wrote this down again, that when Shauna was talking, the Manitoba Research Alliance, I thought what she was talking about, expose, propose, politicize for action and change, is very similar to the sort of cycles within popular education. And popular education comes out of critical literacy work in Brazil and the work of Paulo Freire. It's still done quite a bit in unions. I don't know other fields where a lot of it is done, but this is all stuff that informs my work. And the other area that I think my research has been informed and that's influenced the methodologies I use is work with the Canadian Research Institute for the Advancement of Women, who's a member here. So both Leah and Joanna have done work with Priya. And using intersectional frameworks to approach research. So for example, I did a research project with the Saskatchewan Aboriginal Circle and Organization, and it was looking at the, I'll try not to make this really complicated. It was looking at the independent assessment process, which was the largest part of the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, so it involved 38,000 people. The TRC involved about 6,000, so just to put it in perspective. And it looked at serious physical and sexual abuse and claims by survivors of Indian residential schools. So in looking, what we did is we did a a gender and intersectional analysis about that policy. So looking at how the policy model designed effectively for lawyers didn't take into account women's bodies, homosexual relationships, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very much built on heterosexual, male, normalized model. So essentially, that kind of research putting that kind of lens on that kind of research demonstrated where there might be discrimination in policy practice. So I encourage people, and that's why I was also interested today when Shauna was talking about, if we think about the housing project, how might those housing projects look different for, women with different abilities, single-parent women, low-income men with jail records, whatever, all the complexities of lived lives. So intersectionality allows you to look at both how those forms of identity are both socially constructed, but they're put on you as well as identities that you put on yourself. So in many cases, they're not the way you label yourself, but that others label you. So trying to use those three sort of PLA intersectional frameworks in popular education. And I'm learning as I go, really, like we all are. Okay? So I wanted to give an example of, this is the study we did with the Prairie School for Union Women. It was a study that was participatory action research. And what we did is we looked at how the school was meeting its goals, and we found out that the goals of the school, so if you look at the context of a community-based organization, how goals were being met or where changes might need to happen. And what we found out was that the school is actually transformative in the lives of many women. So what we did then is try and figure out, but there was a problem. They were coming back to work, they were coming back to unions, they were coming back to families, homes, and they were being put into those positions that they had always been put in, and they were being challenged to try and uphold some level of change that they had learned about. So on the one hand, you had a 20-year-old woman who went to the Prairie School for Union Women and came out of it saying, I learned I'm a feminist. On the other hand, she's put into the workplace situation as an admin assistant, and the hierarchy and the boys club that tends to still operate in a lot of unionized workplaces continue to treat her in the same way. So then we wanted to look at how transformation both occurred and how it could be sustained. So we did a second level study on the sustaining the transformation. The data methodologies we used in this one were both key informant interviews and focus groups. But I think what's key in this is not the methods we use for data gathering, but the methods we use later, where we had recommendations that came out of the research that we workshopped with the community, with the Prairie School for Union Women's Steering Committee, and it's 20 women. We workshopped what recommendations were priorities for them, when were they priorities, when should they occur, etc. So it was about workshopping it, but that part was also interesting because that was also about the researcher letting go of whether or not those things happen. And then again, this is a method that people might be familiar with. It was a simple method, really. It's fish and boulders is what it's called. And it's an easy method to identify enablers and obstacles within an organizational setting or we also used it with looking at the participation of marginalized women in municipal politics, which I'll show you on the next slide. This one was being done with an environmental institute in Vietnam. So I just wanted to show that this was not a research project, but I took the methodology and worked with an Indigenous scholar in doing this work. This was actually a national project funded by Status of Women and the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. The sad part about this research is that it sat on the shelf and the city of Saskatoon refused to implement any of the changes. Again, you don't always have control over what happens in research. But we met with the women in, so a key piece of this is also where you meet with the research participants. And we met with them in a back room in the West Side Clinic in Saskatoon, which is a clinic, a community clinic that's primarily works with low-income people. Most of the participants were Indigenous women in this particular focus groups. We also did one with newcomer immigrant and refugee women. And what we had people do is identify on the boulders some of the obstacles that kept them from participating in municipal politics. And then on the fish, some of the ways that they could overcome those obstacles. So if you think back to the, even the popular education thing about identifying the issues, this is one of the ways that we did it. Are there any questions so far? Because I'm going to. So this was a research project that we did with 18 women living on social assistance, and what we were trying to do is get social policy in the province of Saskatchewan changed, because social policy in this province dictated, and this was under an NDP government, that when the child hit the age of 2, the mother had to go look for paid work. Okay? So the policy did not recognize taking care of children as work. It put vulnerable women in a difficult position because to look for work you have to have child care, you have to have transportation, you have to have clothes, nice clothes, and it made a whole bunch of other assumptions, right? So we met with the women who were living this policy as community-based researchers, and we tried to find a way to change social policy, but in a way that wasn't just extracting knowledge from the community, but actually having the women in the community validate the work they were doing. So we did this, oh God. Sorry, I can't remember the year. I know we published something about it, I think in 2011, so it's a little bit old. But it's still relevant. So what we did is some of the women had literacy challenges. So we drew these houses, and what we did is we looked at what were things or obstacles for them to do their work in the house, and what were things that helped them overcome those obstacles. And then the other piece of data gathering we did in that was having people record in a 24-hour clock the work that they did all the time. And then one of the women designed another methodology, and so we all participated in it, and it was like just taking balls and juggling them, and we had to keep all the balls in the air. Because what was really clear when we did the 24-hour clock is, A, people didn't have time to do the 24-hour clock, and that people were doing a whole bunch of different things all the time. They found it really hard to do this, the 24-hour clock. Whereas this one, it was much clearer where there were obstacles and what made it harder to do that work. So after we gathered the data for this, in this project, And we did it by, again, those things that I think have been mentioned several times: food, transportation, childcare were always provided. We also met with the women at the end of the research and decided we wanted to talk about an action. And so we decided to meet with the Minister of Social Services. So we met with the Minister of Social Services, who thanked us and told us that he had such little time to meet with people on social assistance, and he was very thankful for this opportunity. And the women demonstrated the work they do to the Minister of Social Services. But the other thing that happened is the women decided that they wanted to form a group. So they actually formed a group. And we said, well, what do you want to call yourselves? And they wanted to call themselves mums or bums, mums are not bums, or so we worked on all that kind of stuff. But we said, here's the thing. We're community-based researchers, and this research is effectively done, right? Because we made the recommendations to the minister, etc. But they wanted to keep going. So this is where I think, a lesson, I don't care if you're from university or community or where you're from, is that this is a commitment. And so, how do you keep what you're doing? If you've opened a box, then you have some obligation to keep that box open. So we met with the women and tried to help them understand how organizations work and facilitating meetings, and they held a potluck and they brought food for all the family services workers, which I thought was really neat. And they participated in an anti-poverty conference. So they did a few actions, and then we just stepped back. They didn't exist for a long time afterwards, but that's, I think also given the complexities of their lives, I think the whole thing was amazing, actually, that they did what they did. So, yeah. So another piece of research that is relatively new, and that we started working on, not as research, but as activists in this province, is the Saskatchewan government cut the Crown Corporation Saskatchewan Transportation Company a year ago. And so very quickly we started organizing and realizing that the vast majority of people who use public transportation are low-income people and predominantly women. And so we did an exercise using popular education to, again, the whole stuff I was talking about before, to identify, what are some of the issues and how are people's lives affected. So every image, I've got a black and white and a colored copy here. I'll just pass these around, but every image that is present in these posters, which we did, by the way, on large sheets of flip chart, and we hired an artist. Well, she donated her time, but every piece of every image on there is somebody's story, right? About how their lives were impacted. So what happened after this is although this didn't start as research, it became clear. We started a Facebook page that has 1,400 members. It's still active, probably some of you are members. And it became clear that this was an issue that has both local, national, and international implications. And when we spoke on it at the UN, we realized that it's one of the #1 issues for women globally is rural, in particular, rural transportation. And even when we're talking about, the housing, social housing in urban settings, I think what we're going to find in Canada in the next 20 years in the direction we're going is rural ghettos throughout the country. So it was pretty, it still is pretty fresh and pretty interesting work. And it's also, I think it's an unusual example of community-based research because the organization is a Facebook page. you know? Yet it represents a much broader community, you know? And people who are, particularly people who, you know, got out of jail and had a way home to their community, or women who are fleeing violence. There's just been a study in this province done that showed the majority of women fleeing violence are now calling the RCMP, social services, or hitchhiking to get out of those situations. So it's I think, really important work. So, I mean, it also illustrates that, you know, community-based research can certainly come at you from very different ways, and there can be very different ways of responding. And so, on that note, oops, this was one other example. This is an example of research that wasn't called research. It was called research. Knowledge synthesis, yes, it's there. So basically it was taking research that already existed and bringing it together. And Leah was one of the people involved in this. And it involved gathering data from indigenous peoples primarily, and also documents using intersectional and Western knowledge frameworks to look at how we could better use knowledge constructions to create better research. So that was another example of work that might actually be useful to people in doing this kind of work. So I did have one more. This is, I think this is the last slide, another example of a research methodology that is participatory, and I learned that this is called arts-based research. See, I'm just learning all this stuff as I do it. But essentially it's called arts-based research because it uses art, and in the end, the knowledge dissemination was through art. Although that was never intended. It happened. So essentially what it was, and this was a SHRC grant to look at 3 generations of Indigenous textile artists in Chile and Saskatchewan, and how knowledge about the art was being passed from generation to generation. And in the focus group, people were asked to bring items from, for example, in Saskatchewan, items from their beading practice that reminded them of stories in their history of beading, okay? So then we all sat in a circle, and the items were used, either passed from person to person, and people told their story about that object or related it to a story in their life, or one person would just pick up a story. It was loosely constructed in that way that they could choose that. But we used the basic ideas and principles of a talking circle, but adding the Indigenous methodologies around storytelling, and also the concept of blood memory. So using the idea that of our memory being triggered when we see these things, and that reminding us of a story. So in order to construct the whole story, we use the individual stories. So
do you know which part of Chile did you go?
Yeah, Tirua.
Okay.
And Temuco.
Okay.
I used to work in Temuco.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So that relationship extended back to 1993.
So you got in touch with the Mapuches?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I worked with the Mapuches.
My people.
Yeah. Chaltumay. This group could share an example of creative research, data gathering, an example you have from experience or that you talked about?
Sure. The other barriers, I'm having a public hearing on this side because there's a fan going, so
Yeah.
you can speak up, whoever's speaking.
Okay.
Okay, you want me to?
Yeah, you can start saying.
Okay, I'm gonna stand up and I'm gonna use my theater voice then. Okay, so we were sharing different ways and creative ways, but the group chose me. So what I have used in the past is what is called PATH. I don't know if some of you know it. So I used to work with disabled people, and some of them, they were non-verbal. So what we do is just have a big piece of paper on the wall, and we draw a road with an arrow and a circle at the end. That's the dream. So for people who are non-verbal, they point at their board because they have a way of communicating differently than we all do. So we plan in 3 months, 6 months, what do you have now, and who do you have to help you to get to your dream? And then at the end, it's all graphic, no words. So you have to have a person who does the graphics with different markers and stick people. You don't need to be an artist or painter or anything like that. Symbols. So when you get at the end, the person name their dream. What is my dream? And then they make some sort of mark, or they ask somebody to sign for them when they're not verbal or not moving, that is theirs. So they make it there. So it serves the purpose of planning, and it also is like dream board that some people do. And that's a way of communicating and also setting priorities of what the person needs to do, what they have, how to get there, and they're on the road. That's what I do.
Very good.
Thank you.
You do theater. Okay, how about this group right here?
Well, we talked a little bit about, a couple of us work in early childhood, and so ways of kind of getting children's ideas and things. So you know, documenting their play, using photographs, using their artwork, particularly especially if you use like self-portraits from one point in time to another point in time, see all sorts of change. So we talked a little bit about that.
Great. Small group?
Again, we admitted our advantage.
Can you
Oh,
go
sorry.
in?
Oh,
Project?
sorry. Again, we admitted that we had a full advantage because Joanne was a member of our group. And I was fortunate enough to participate in her session yesterday as well. So there were lots of ideas flowing and conversations happening around what we learned there. But one that kind of resonated with us that Joanne had discussed with us was the idea of photos. Because that crosses language and literacy barriers, and everybody has a cell phone. So taking a photo of something in your home, like the example that we discussed was health. So if somebody is sick in your house, what do you do? Or like take a photo of how this phenomenon makes you feel, so that you can put together a collage of photos and collect themes from that.
Okay, so can I just ask a question? Would that be similar to photo voice?
Yes.
Okay, so there's a lot written on this methodology. I like the cell phone idea. I haven't heard that before. But it is a methodology that's been used, participatory methodology, quite extensively used in healthcare, but it's used much broader than that. So I'm just going to put it in brackets, photo voice. How about that? Okay. And
Well, one that, and we didn't have the benefit of a lot of researchers in our group, so we kind of went off tangentially. But what we talked about was the creation of a community play by an organization. This was several years ago, and they went into the community and did a lot of interviews. A playwright did a lot of interviews with both the Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities, created this play, had people from the very different groups within the community participate as actors in the play. And then the community had the play so that they could redo it if they so chose. And people were talking about how the year before, they would walk down the street and just pass one another and not even make eye contact. And after working together on that play, they'd go for coffee together. And that same group has continued, they've sort of honed their practice, and they continue to do that kind of work in, now mainly in northern communities, but it's the same sort of process where they work very much with the participating community to develop whatever the product is going to be.
Okay, excellent. That's not by any chance the group that did the play on homelessness?
No, it could be, it's Common Wheel, and this was the first play was in Fort Qu'Appelle.
Oh, the gathering.
Yeah, the one that was in
Yeah.
behind Fort Sand.
Yeah, the gathering.
It was, and that's how that all
Yeah.
transpired. It was brilliant to see it, and it was really fascinating to talk to people from the community about it and how enthusiastic they were about the process.
Okay.
So our group picked me to, told me. So one of the most recent research projects that I'm involved with is a traditional indigenous men doing a moose hunt this year. And the way we're gathering a lot of our data is through sharing circles. So we're having a series of sharing circles throughout the year. And various men will be coming in and describing their thoughts on preparing to go through the moose hunt, and we're following the medicine wheel, some elder teachings, and we guide through fairly well-seasoned hunter. So we'll keep you posted on that. But yeah, we got funded through CIHR to do a traditional moose hunt this fall. So that'll be coming up probably in November. We'll see how that goes. Yeah, well, sharing circles is a good way to hopefully gather some evidence. Traditionally, what's shared inside the sharing circle stays inside the sharing circle, but we're stripping out obviously names, times, dates, and those types of things. And we're just going to be looking at common themes and kind of the thoughts of the men who are participating within the research project.
Okay, and then there's a feast at the end.
Well, if they... Some people say catch and moose, but yeah. If they harvest it, yeah.
Well, you know, one of the interesting things about the study on intergenerational learning in Indigenous textiles is every elder who participated started by talking about the hunt. Every elder. Not the younger generation. So it's really good. Okay, so this is... Oh, you're in it, okay. Okay, so how about the center and then...
Sure. So we talked a lot about...
Can you hear her?
No. We talked a lot about the idea of being a choreographer. So that, you know, when you're working in the community, depending on what the community's needs are and the direction you're going, starting to collaborate together and maybe consider an artist that you might want to come in to work in with you on your project, because artists are almost always, I would hope, creative individuals who are exploring ideas and concepts in their own work. So to think about, you know, if you're wanting to work with kids, for example, and have them bring out stories, maybe bring in an artist who's a rapper who can really stimulate and get those kids engaged and excited to participate. So it's a matter maybe of connecting those dots and figuring out what interest the participants will be, whether it's from a craft-based practice or from a theatrical, but then bringing in an artist who is working in that area that brings that passion to the project and then stimulates a whole new thing, and everybody's on this new road of some forms of discovery.
So that was kind of the gist of
I'm just going to give a little thought on that one. Just a little, bubble. I wonder if the artist is also a facilitator. That's the bubble. It's unanswered.
So our little group had a problem because we're just getting started. So we don't really have any interaction.
You're not tarnished, you mean?
That's
So,
yeah.
sharing their stories, and the importance and the power that is given to people when their stories are validated and appreciated, and how that, just that one tiny little piece can be transformative. And also then understanding who you're talking to, who you're talking with, and how to best, support them in their talent.
Okay, so those are really good points and very important. We can't create safe spaces, but we can work towards creating safety in those spaces. I mean, we can always work towards it. We can't guarantee it. Okay, so background in the background.
Well, we talked about a lot of these different media as well as being valuable. So, and our last bit of discussion was on the power, two pieces, I guess, I'm sharing. The power of stories, personal stories, to stimulate the discussion among others. So there was a couple of examples shared of that, where one was an immigrant woman, I believe, that shared a very powerful story, and then the discussion went on from there with the rest of the participants. And then the second one we also talked about was having multiple methods within a group. So if you have a question or an issue, giving people that choice. I don't know how well that works, or how well you think that works. So somebody might want to use artwork, while someone else might want to tell a story.
Right. Yeah, and that does happen. I mean, even the study that we did on intergenerational learning with Indigenous women, one woman said that she didn't want to be part of the group, she wanted to be interviewed. So that happened. Okay.
And over here, just the last two groups, you touched on something that fits with a couple examples that I have. So I work with vulnerable children and their families, and as part of my professional development, I did some child play therapy training. And one of the things they talked about, and specifically the seminar, was dealing with children that are they're suffering loss and grief, and complex loss and grief as well. And so at work, we often have morning circle times. And as young children will blurt out something they've experienced, what happens is it gives them other children the opportunity to hear and also to share. And what happens is that their grief and their pain and their loss and the bereavement, it actually starts to develop and change a little bit, and it gives them opportunity to really the free, safe place just to be. And another thing that got treated is in sand and water play, and it was the idea of it being a safe place to express themselves. And with play-based, therapeutic play-based, or sand and water play, if it's therapeutically based, the idea is that this is their world, and this world can be whatever they want it to be. And in that, as they're given that freedom to put the objects together and form them however they want to play on them, and however they want, you begin to start to see themes emerge. And it gives you some real insight into their experiences. So it gives you that data that you would need.
Thank you. I'm sorry. Maybe.
Everything shuts off.
Okay, so that was therapy. So I'm just, is this going to come back on?
Yeah, sure.
So thank you to all the groups for sharing these ideas. I want to just, provide a couple more examples of how. Here, I'll turn the screen. A couple more examples of how data can be shared through knowledge mobilization. I think somebody had started talking about, the actual, how do you share what you've learned? And so in the study that we did on intergenerational learning and Indigenous textiles, the women in Saskatchewan, this was my perhaps flawed or different understanding of reciprocity, is I asked the women what they would like to do with the results of the research. And they said they wanted to have an art exhibit. And the women in Chile said they wanted a book. And so, because I was perhaps, I don't know what it was, naive, silly, whatever, I thought, okay, you promised it. Part about being a community-based researcher is you better live out your values. And you said, you were doing a reciprocal process. This is what people said they wanted, so I felt compelled. So anyway, but it turned out it was more difficult to write a book with people in Chile who were from an oral culture, and so anyway, that was another process. So I ended up hiring grad students to help with writing books. But the group in Saskatchewan wanted an art exhibit, and so I ended up curating an art exhibit in a public art gallery with the women. And one of the things that they all agreed to do, that they wanted to do, was put their pictures, their identities forward. So it was part of the ethics process, but each one of them had a poster created about who they were, and a little bit of a quote from them and a little bit of information about who they were. So in the exhibition, all of the women had a poster about them present. They all had examples of beadwork that they had done or that were done in their family. They attended, they spoke to the media about their work. So that was all part of the knowledge dissemination. And so this was a picture from the exhibition. The art in the back that's framed was actually framed by one of the women in the research project. She framed her own work. She wanted to have ownership over how it was presented. And another woman had done the beadwork on the back of the jacket. We worked with a professional gallery to exhibit the work. And then this is a copy of the book that was written on the research. So all of this went way beyond, what there was funding to do or all the rest. So I think there are real lessons in it for me on reciprocity and what we mean by that. And so I was really thankful yesterday, in fact, when I attended Leah's workshop and we talked about having an agreement in terms of what you each mean by reciprocity in the process, because there's not a lot written on reciprocity and what is meant by it. And I was taking my cues from doing Indigenous research and elders and Linda Tuwai Smith and book on decolonizing methodologies. And clearly, there are multiple ways of interpreting that. I went to a workshop by an Indigenous researcher who talked about the memory sticks and notebooks and blame that they had given research participants as part of their reciprocal process. So clearly it means very different things to different people. And I think it's an area that more research needs to be done in. And I was so happy to hear about the theater idea because I got a large research grant a couple of years ago that Leah is also involved in, and it's a study on the IEP, the Independent Assessment Process, the Indian Residential School Claims Process Settlement, that I mentioned earlier. And the research, ultimately, those records, those 38,000 records are being destroyed by the Government of Canada. So the project is aimed at creating public memory about that period of colonization and about those pieces. And so the goal eventually is to produce theater that can be live streamed and performed live, involving the people from communities who are part of the research project. So I was so excited that you actually came up with that idea. So, and finally, I guess I had all the. So the final slide here I have is we make the path by walking, a quote from Paul Freire. And I think why this is important to me is that we're learning as we go. And sometimes when we do things and we create a certain way of doing it, others might follow if it seems like a way that can create change in how we do our work. And the important thing that I keep telling grad students in the room is there's not a right and wrong way of doing this, and don't beat yourself up. So hopefully I can also illustrate that, you know, I think I've made mistakes and I'm learning as I go along. So, are there any questions?
I just wanted to ask you if in your intersection of feminist framework that was involved in creating that Korea, if you've become, you didn't know that I actually wrote that?
No,
You didn't?
no, I would have acknowledged.
But anyways, yeah, it was a struggle to shift the organization to an intersectional framework, but that's another story.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering if Korea or yourself have begun to integrate transnational feminist frameworks, given the new condition of globalization, and really interrogating citizenship as another structure of inequality that is co-constitutive of the other race, class, gender, sexuality, and the others that we usually talk about. So I'm wondering where you're at in Korea and your own research in that regard.
Okay, so I think in terms of interrogating citizenship, I kind of don't think that's really happening, that might just be me and not other people involved. But what I will say is that we just got a grant for $800,000 to do research with women's and equity-seeking groups across the country and looking at how intersectionality is actually being practiced and understood, and to develop new and you know, hopefully improved tools for people to, and we're going to provide training, and that training will also be online, and so to get more people doing intersectional work, both in terms of research and also in terms of the operations of understanding in organizations. So yeah, so you know, if you don't know about Korea, I suggest there's a lot of free resources as well there on the page, and it's Canada's only feminist national research organization.
Now, but is it restricted to academics?
No, definitely not. In fact, the board is made up of academics and community-based people, and we try to operate using an intersectional framework. So 1 year the president's an academic, next year it's a community person. We try to have community people, representation across the country, representation of gender, or of race, ethnicity, place. It's a complex thing. I have to say, it's very complex, and it's voluntary. So, yeah.
Sorry to show my ignorance, but you could just
I'm going to shut this
briefly
off. I
touch
can
on-
agree with your point about not hearing. I can't. Oh, unless you wanted me to point this slide.
I don't care. I was wondering about how you turn these into data, if you could just briefly describe that process.
Okay, so which?
Theater, for example.
How you turn theater into data. So it's getting people to identify the issues, right? So maybe that's through improv, maybe it's through, I think it would depend on how exactly you're using it, but you could use people in small groups identifying issues, coming together, problematizing the issue, politicizing the issue, and then developing a collective production that can illustrate ways that people see change happening. That might be a very simplified example, but you could look, it's popular theater, popular education, very much follow that kind of trajectory.
So like as if you were doing interviews instead of doing interviews and looking for themes in the interviews, you're just producing play and looking for themes through the
Yeah,
process.
well, it's somewhat, you could use multi-methods, right? So you could also, work with that small group that had created the theater improv or whatever and do in-depth interviews on how they felt in that position, why they did that, where's that coming from, what do they see as the issues in what they're doing, how do they see those issues being resolved, what do they see as the social, economic, and political factors that are influencing those. So you could use that as a starting point and go more in depth. I don't have the answers, I'm just brainstorming it,
I have a question, actually, and a comment. So, I don't know if this is useful or not, but I am constantly in a process of reminding myself that methods still, like on the one hand, we think about the sort of use of methods as they emerge through our collaborations with communities. And on the other hand, methods are still driven by questions. So for me, when I heard your question, my answer was, well, it depends on what the question is. Like if the question is, what's people's experience in the process of participatory theater, then the data is something that allows you to gather information about participant experience. But if the question is, what do participants create when they're asked, I'm sorry I'm yelling too, I'm still thinking I'm supposed to be battling the fan. But yeah, and if the question is, what do participants create when tasked with this method, then the script, like the play, is the data. Or how are participants how are viewers affected by, then, the survey is that, so it's, so I think we apply methods on top of methods in some ways, kind of depending on how they fit.
And what's important about what you've just said is you see the value in collaborating with others in your understanding of how to develop a method, right? So, what started out as a question that, of interest, and then, how that can morph into something, we could complicate that and probably come up with a really interesting method. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, so my question, I don't want to take up too much time, but I was just wondering, Cindy, if you would reflect, because we were having a brief conversation at the end of the last session about the fact that methods that are participatory are not can be employed in projects that are not community-based. So what I mean is that, like, we could conceivably employ a photo voice in a project that's been constructed in the head of a researcher in an institution, right? So I'm just wondering if this is, I'm wondering if you have examples of different kinds of uses, like a place where you developed where you decided the method that you would use collaboratively, or whether you maybe want to disagree with me and say, like, the participatory method sort of does inherently make a project participatory. Am I making sense?
Oh, well, I think that's actually a really complicated question, because you can have a participatory method and it might not be participatory research.
That's my question. Do you think that that's, like, that would be what I would say. My position on that would be, so I'm just curious about your thoughts on it.
That would be my position,
Would that,
is that you could have be using participatory methodologies to gather your data. And again, because that might be the most appropriate way to gather the data with the group that you're working with. But the way that you've constructed the research, right from who's funding it, who's asking the questions, what's the data going to be used for, you know, like the research we did with the fish was, you know, looking at obstacles for marginalized women's participation in municipal politics. The co-researcher I worked with called that PAR. And we had a long discussion about it. And I refused to call that PAR because the funding was national. We were a local example within the national. We didn't define the questions. We used participatory methodologies to gather the data, but that data was written into a report that was never, those women had no control over whether that data was used or not. In fact, the city of Saskatoon refused to make those changes. So, to me, that was not proper.
That's helpful. I'm just, you know, this is
Yeah.
just me.
The participants don't co-own the data, they can't call it for research.
No, or they have no control over that data. But it doesn't mean you can't use, and sometimes you don't, you know, when you're doing policy research, it's really tricky doing, you know, something that you can call PAR, because you might not be the ultimate decision makers on how that data gets used. But you can use participatory methodologies if they're the appropriate methodology to use.
Community-based.
Yeah, well, I mean, sometimes when you're interviewing managers or something, interviews work really well because they don't want to touch you or whatever. Anyway, so thank you very much. And if people still have questions, they can